welcome to 5 Frames From. Today I'm talking about Bout de Souffle, which I'm not going to be able to pronounce consistently all the way through, so I might call it by its English name, which is Breathless. And this is a key film from the French New Wave by Jean-Luc Godard. Now, Godard was already a successful film critic, and he described making his own films as also being part of that criticism. He had a lot to say about filmmaking and filmmaking styles and what film was. He was very much someone who pushed the boundaries and liked to break the rules and really experiment with those forms that already existed. His knowledge of films was huge, and in Breathless, there's a lot of references to other films, American films in particular. Now, the French New Wave came about because a number of young filmmakers rejected the traditional established cinema at the time. So, cinema du papa or daddy cinema was considered to be quite formulaic. Very often like studio based, using kind of large expensive cameras. They were often based on sort of literary adaptations or spiritual ideas, very sort of script heavy rather than action heavy. And Godard and his peers felt that this lacked imagination and interest. So the French New Wave was about capturing the spirit of youth in cinema and doing something a bit different. And what Godard and his peers proved is that you could make cinema much more cheaply if you used sort of lighter handheld cameras, which were already being used in the documentary movement. And Godard was inspired by what he'd seen in documentaries and was keen to sort of, with Breathless, make something that fell between narrative and documentary. What we see at the time with French New Wave, which is sort of around 1958 through to 1962, is lots of new filmmakers, lots of them sort of around the age of 30, sort of bursting onto the scene, being able to make films much more cheaply than they had before, and therefore challenging that tradition of cinema and shaking things up. And films like Breathless really did get people excited and caused a bit of an uproar. So overall, French New Wave really changed the way that people thought about cinema and introduced a number of new techniques that would become a universal part of film language. So in this first frame that I've chosen, we can see that we're filming on location, and here Michel has just stolen a car and he's en route to Paris to collect some money and try and win back Patricia, who he's desperate to sleep with again. This isn't a neat opening to a film. We start with disruption. We start with Michel stealing a car and we see his criminal behaviour. And as he drives along to Paris, he's talking to himself. He's singing, not very tunefully, but mentioning Patricia's name in the sounds that he's making. And he's sort of insulting the people around him. So he sees some hitchhikers and he refuses to pick them up because they're too ugly. So already we've got an unusual opening to a film. And even as a modern viewer, it's quite difficult to like Michel at this point. He is not a very nice character. We can see the influence of American gangster films, particularly with Michel's hat and also his cigarette, which he seems to be smoking constantly, and later on we'll talk about the influence of gangster films on Michel's life. The camera person is obviously sat in the car next to Michel, filming him in this close-up. However, the most unusual thing about this moment is, of course, that Michel is breaking the fourth wall. He's talking to us directly. So he says, if you don't like cities, you can get stuffed. And so he's making eye contact with us. We've got that direct address, and he's quite rude to us by telling us we can get stuffed. And all of this is very unusual. I don't know how engaging it really is. It bears no relevance to the plot. We don't see him do this again. But if we think about films and we think about this as a critique of films, normally we are just observing what's going on. We are not involved in the film. But here we're placed in the seat of the passenger, and Michel's talking directly to us, and so therefore we're a bit more of a participant in the film itself. So I've said that Michel isn't very likeable, but I think if you were a male viewer watching at the time, you'd probably quite like him. And this scene in the car does create some comedy, some humour, and actually He's very attractive, he's a good looking male, perhaps someone that the male audience would aspire to be like, and so therefore actually we are prepared to go on this journey with him and align ourselves with him. This illustrates what Laura Mulvey talks about with the male gaze, the idea that in the audience we are positioned as the male character or with the male character. And as I said, male viewers would find that character aspirational or find something to identify with in the character themselves. The way that Michelle looks at women also illustrates the male gaze. So, right at the very start of the film, we see him looking in the newspaper and we see adverts of women that are scantily clad. Later on, when he finally arrives in Paris and he needs money, he goes to visit one of his many women, and also she is scantily clad. She's in a state of undress and she's getting ready to go out, and she's kind of romantically attached to him, even though we know he's a little bit of a womanizer. He's left one woman already, can't take her with him in the car. He's been to visit this one, but the one that he really wants is Patricia. In terms of genre, this film has been described as having elements of comedy, but it's also described as a sort of crime, thriller, detective novel. I also think the description of it being a romance is really important, because depending on how you watch it, the relationship between Patricia and Michelle is potentially the most important thing and most interesting thing in the film. So before we move on, I just want to say a couple of things about the sound that we would be hearing at this point. So within the sound we have that dialogue. Apparently all the sound was dubbed afterwards, which is again quite unusual, but did allow for Godard to kind of shout the lines to the actors. Apparently a lot of the script was improvised or written at the last minute, so the actors perhaps didn't have time to really learn all of their lines. So by dubbing the sound, that erased that issue. But previous to this moment, we do hear Michelle's kind of theme tune, and it's jazz in style and perhaps a little bit sleazy and mischievous. This contrasts with Patricia's music slash theme, which is much more romantic in style. So my second frame is this over-the-shoulder shot when Michelle has arrived in Paris and he goes to the girl's apartment to try and get some money off her. While her back is turned, he's also stealing money. So he shows that he is not a trustworthy character. He swindles people. We see even more of his criminal behaviour. Now, the over-the-shoulder shot would usually be used in conversations with another character. And while Michelle is having a conversation with the girl that's going to lend him money, she doesn't appear on screen here, and they often don't appear in the same frame. Clearly, Michelle is more interested in himself than he is in the girl, and perhaps this suggests that Michelle is a bit of a lonely character, a bit of a loner, and that his relationships aren't particularly meaningful, which is why I think we're so interested in his relationship with Patricia and not surprised that there is no happy ending for the pair of them. Having said all of that, the main reason I've chosen this shot is because of all the mirrors, and if you look you can see there's at least 2 mirrors, there's different reflections in there. It's like the big mirror isn't enough for him to be able to see his full beauty. And this is something that I would normally associate more with the film noir. And this film is clearly heavily influenced by noir films. We could argue that Patricia is the femme fatale, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on, and that Michelle's demise is inevitable by the end. But usually in film noir, I would associate the mirror with the femme fatale and the idea of her identity being obscured. But here, we've got that same idea that actually we don't really know who Michelle is, what his kind of backstory is, where he's come from. For example, we don't know why he needs the money from the guy in Paris. We've got these different reflections which show that perhaps he's duplicitous. Of course, it could also show a sort of narcissistic side to Michelle, and we know he's kind of obsessed with his image, how he looks, and trying to be like Humphrey Bogart, so we've got that suggestion here. The idea that we don't really know Michelle also comes across when later on he's called Mr. Kovacs. So he has more than one name. We also find out he's got a passport in the name of Kovacs as well, which he claims is his sort of half-brothers. So Again, we don't really know who Michel is and whether or not to trust him. Certainly here we get a sense of him being duplicitous. His facial expression here is very serious. He's staring at himself intently. So again, that idea of narcissism. But also that idea of being influenced by the movie stars that he's seen on the screen. I get a sense that Michel is acting in a way that he would expect his on-screen idols to behave. That sort of moody, smouldering look is something that we see on the poster of Humphrey Bogart later on as well. So I just want to finish off this frame by adding in an extra frame, this one of Patricia that comes much, much later in the film. But we do often see Patricia looking in mirrors and mimicking the facial expressions that Michel uses. She also says things like, "I can see myself reflected in your eyes." So I think there are a lot of moments where Patricia and Michel are very, very similar. And again, that perhaps gives us the idea that Patricia is going to betray him long before she actually does. She's like Michel, not trustworthy, narcissistic, and possibly got these very superficial relationships. So we know that Michel is attracted to all things American, and in this shot we see Patricia, the American living in Paris, literally labelled as American because she is wearing the New York Tribune t-shirt. In the dialogue, she's calling out New York Herald Tribune. She's speaking in English at this point, and we can hear her American accent. Undoubtedly, the fact that she's from America adds to her attraction for Michel, and often she relies on him to translate particular words, slang words that he tends to use. This third frame is a two-shot and it's a long shot. We can see in the background all the hubbub of Paris, the busy city life. And again, we've got that filming on location that was part of the French New Wave ideas. This shot allows us to see the costumes of both of them really clearly. I've already mentioned Patricia's t-shirt, but her style of dress and her haircut is particularly modern. She stands out as a bit different. She's very stylish and very beautiful. Again, a very attractive actor. In comparison, we've got Michel's gangster style outfit, which now we can see looks slightly uncomfortable on him. The jacket is slightly too big. It doesn't quite fit him. He almost looks like a little boy in grown-up clothing. And I think as the film goes on, especially in the scenes where the lovers are in the apartment, we get more close-ups of Michel and we get to see really how young he is. And at the end, it's particularly tragic because he loses his life at such a young age. And there we have the suggestion that being the gangster and being the bad boy doesn't really suit Michel, that he has perhaps kind of fallen into it. And again, we're getting that sense of not really knowing who he is and how he got to where he is. Interestingly, at the end, when he lies dying on the road, he's no longer wearing the jacket or the hat. So he's taken off elements of the gangster. He's still wearing his glasses, he's still smoking, he calls Patricia a creep. But ultimately, he's taken off that jacket that's too big and he looks much more innocent than he does elsewhere in the film. I think the fact that this is a two-shot is really useful in terms of comparing it to the end of the film, where we see both Michel and Patricia in separate shots. They're in close-up at the end of the film, and we'll see a frame from that later on, but completely separate. Here in these shots where he meets up with Patricia for the first time since he's been away, two shots where they look very comfortable together. In a moment in the film, they turn around and they start walking towards the camera as it tracks back or is handheld and moves backwards, and they become closer and closer until they're sort of physically touching each other as they're walking along. They're very comfortable in each other's presence. So these two shots suggest that their relationship is more meaningful, that the relationship means a lot to Michel. We know that they've been physically intimate together. We find that out a bit later in the film. And this creates enigma for the audience because we're wondering if Patricia will go away with him. He wants her to come to Rome. Patricia appears to be an independent woman. We see her earning money here, selling newspapers, but we also see her later on in the film going off on various journalistic assignments. However, one of the things to notice about Patricia is that often she's surrounded by men who are trying to tell her what to do. And although she comes across as independent and wanting to earn money and she rejects Michel's proposal, it's still very difficult for her to live in this patriarchal society as a free, independent woman. So frame number 4 is actually 3 different frames, and I've chosen these because they're all references to other films or references to kind of popular culture that Michelle is influenced by. Before I talk about that in a bit more detail though, I want to talk about the poster in the top corner. So an example of kind of popular culture posters, magazines and newspapers that are used throughout the film to kind of give messages. And this one, we're told, says, "Live dangerously until the end." And I think this highlights the obsession really that Michelle has with death. He says in the film that he's always thinking about death. And there's a link between kind of women leading to death, which of course is what happens with Patricia. Patricia, though, in the same scene tells us that she doesn't think about death. There's another quote that I think is really useful as well in summing up Michelle and his sort of attitudes, and that's when the writer says his greatest ambition is to be immortal and then die. And I think this really sums up what Michelle feels. He wants to be immortal, immortalised like one of these Hollywood stars, and then pass away quickly. And of course, at the end, he doesn't really resist arrest. He doesn't really stop the situation with the police. He gets shot. He's ready to go. He's sort of tired by that point. I think there are other indications as well that he is aware of time and time running out. And I think this is particularly seen in the amount of times he asks what the time is, or he checks his watch, or he buys the late edition of the newspaper. There's a sense of him marking time before the end. And he wants to make his mark on the world before the end. So this poster at the very top really reflects that. Then in the middle, we've got the images of Humphrey Bogart. There's a slightly bigger one just to the side. We get a point of view eyeline match of Michelle looking at Humphrey Bogart, and then he does the movement where he rubs his thumb over his lips, just like Bogart was known to do. So that influence and connection, this is someone that he really admires and wants to be like. What we need to remember is, again, Godard's interest and knowledge of films, and Godard really regarded Humphrey Bogart as a fantastic actor. So some of the things that Michelle does really illustrate Godard's interest in films and knowledge of films. This shot at the bottom then, this kind of iris shot, is reminiscent of the silent movie era. And I think there's a bit of a connection there. But more specifically, this moment where Patricia is looking down the rolled up poster to Michelle is meant to be a reference to a film called 40 Guns by Samuel Fuller. And apparently this wasn't a particularly well-known film, but it was one that Godard had written about in his reviews. In this scene from Breathless, Patricia looks down the rolled up poster, sees Michelle, and then we cut to a moment where they're kissing. And the idea there is that the moment where actually she's been persuaded to sleep with Michelle again has been elided, just like in the film 40 Guns, where the seductress looks down the barrel of a gun rather than a rolled up piece of paper. So I'm sure there's much more you could say on things like popular culture and the influence of films on Michelle, and on intertextual references generally, so do go away and have a bit more of a look at the film to find some more of those. So for my fifth and final frame, I've decided to leave us with this shot of Patricia, which comes right at the very end of the film. Here she's taken on many of the things that Michelle did earlier in the film, so she is breaking the fourth wall, she's looking at us directly, that eye contact is very powerful. And creates enigma in that we're wondering what she's thinking or what she's challenging us to think. She's also doing the movement that Michelle has done throughout, the thumb across the lips, which was that link to Humphrey Bogart. So again, there's these questions about why she's doing these things that Michelle did, especially considering that she is the one who has turned him into the police. As I said earlier, we see these close-ups of Patricia and Michelle cut together in straight cuts, and here we're not seeing that connection that we saw earlier. They are not a couple, they are not together, they are kind of more enemies at this point. He says that she's a creep, for example. Now, if Patricia is the femme fatale, as has been suggested by some critics, it's surprising here that she survives, because normally the femme fatale is punished for her misdemeanours and killed at the end. Here though, it's Michelle that's dead, but of course it's at the hand of Patricia because she has betrayed him. So perhaps we could argue that Patricia is the more complex character. She lives in a world where men try to control her, but she's forging her own independent path. She's trying to create her own career. And she knows she doesn't want to be with Michelle, even though she's potentially pregnant. She knows she's better off alone and therefore turns him into the police at the end. She's also the final character that we see. And as I say, she challenges us to wonder what she is thinking and what her motivations are. She's perhaps the one that we go away and think more about after the screen goes black. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with that thought about Patricia. Though interestingly, if we look at the poster here, we can see that she's above him and looking over him and looking a little bit sly in terms of her facial expression. So there's some suggestion that she's in control of the situation. Anyway, I'm going to leave you and suggest that you choose your own 5 frames from Breathless to have a look at. Thanks for watching and see you again soon. Bye bye.